Throughout this course, we have been discussing different types of cryptography from a technical and capability standpoint. We will now turn our focus toward the legal discussions that have recently arisen in regards to the public use of encryption. You have already learned that cryptography is not new. It has been around for thousands of years, and many different sectors of society have and still do use cryptography to protect the information they consider to be sensitive. Governments around the world encrypt a lot of information. This is typically information that, if leaked, could pose a danger to that nation or the people within the nation. It goes without saying that governments should maintain some level of secrecy over military capabilities, sensitive political activities, and even the information they discover about other nations. Cryptography is one of the ways this data can be kept safe. And many governments also have people employed who try to crack the encryption of other nations so they can have an upper hand in any future negotiations or wars. This is considered normal activity at the government level, and most nations have programs to fulfill these goals. But other organizations also use cryptography to protect their information. Corporations also have sensitive data that, if leaked, could cost them millions of dollars in revenue, so they have to take measures to secure that data. Recent credit card number thefts from large retail chains highlighted part of this concern, as the data they were storing was not encrypted, and it made it much easier for a criminal to use. Had encryption been properly used, the damage would have been much smaller. The hack against the U.S. Office of Personnel Management falls into a similar category of how encryption could have protected user data. Both of these were failures that highlight why we need these capabilities. And if the government and private corporations have access to encryption technology, then individuals should also have this capability. And we do. The same encryption standard used by the U.S. government to secure data is available to everyone else, not only in the United States, but all around the world. The AES cipher we discussed earlier is the standard that is commonly employed. Individual encryption is not as high as it is in other sectors, but it has slowly been increasing in the past few years as stories about government data collection on private citizens has been revealed. Some people have decided to start encrypting their smartphones, emails, and personal files to protect themselves against a variety of potential eavesdropping activity. Even criminals have employed encryption in some viruses that encrypt a user's content and requires a ransom to be paid for the key. So why is this so important? It is common for people to say they don't have anything to hide, so they don't care if the government reads their emails. But what about criminals trying to read your emails? What about criminals trying to access the banking information sitting unencrypted on your hard drive? What about criminals trying to steal your phone so they can easily access all of the accounts you have set up for ease of access? There is actually a lot more risk to individuals than is typically realized. Encryption helps to limit personal damage because if a criminal cannot read your data, they will not be able to manipulate it to attain their goals. We used to say that turning on the encryption on a wireless router was enough to deter most criminals because so many wireless routers were unprotected that they would just move on to an easier target. I think the same is true today with the use of encrypted data. A criminal knows how impossible it is to break an AES cipher, so if they see you are encrypting your data or communication, they are likely to move on to an easier target. Private data needs to remain private, whether that is communication between two parties, two private citizens, financial information, or any other data you deem to be private. Having the ability to encrypt your private data is what helps to keep it private. But because the use of encryption is rising in the public sector, some people want to take that capability away. There has been a recent rash of government officials in the United States and in Great Britain who have spoken out against the use of encryption. Some have gone so far to say encryption should be made illegal for anything outside of government use, while others have only suggested the manufacturer should create a backdoor in their software that allows law enforcement personnel to decrypt data when law enforcement actions are warranted. There tends to be a difference of opinion within the government and in the public sector, and it almost all revolves around personal and corporate privacy issues. For personal privacy, we already covered this topic to some degree. But the concern is that a backdoor capability or a lack of encryption altogether takes away a person's individual right to keep their private information private. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2014 that police officers could not search a cell phone without a warrant based on the premise that there is so much more information on a phone today than simple phone numbers, and police officers don't have a need to access all the content on a person's phone. Users who lock their phones with a PIN code or similar security function were being forced by the police to unlock their phones, which ultimately landed in the Supreme Court and generated this ruling. A court will need to issue a warrant in order for law enforcement to gain this level of access, and the same should be true to force a user to decrypt their information. Now, there are some good arguments on both sides of this discussion. Most users state that they don't have anything to hide, so they don't care if someone can view their data or monitor their communications. So, to some degree, this is a personal preference issue. Some people aren't concerned, and that is perfectly fine. But we also need to visit the idea that the need for court-issued warrants is a method that keeps other branches of government from overreaching their authority, and the sometimes ease of accessing someone's information because they are unable to encrypt it may make warrants less valuable. Now, this is a valid argument because the technology we have available today can allow us to bypass many security features built into devices except in the area of encryption. If I have physical access to a computer, I can break a password in under 5 minutes. And I can use a forensic system to bypass or break common security features on a phone. But if encryption is involved, the job of accessing the data is pretty much impossible. On the other side of the coin, the government also has a valid point. If a criminal encrypts their data, the government will have a difficult time investigating or prosecuting a case because the needed evidence could be encrypted. A court could issue a warrant ordering the suspect to decrypt the contents, but the suspect could still refuse, claim to have forgotten the password, or could even use the Fifth Amendment as a level of protection. The Fifth Circuit Appeals Court ruled in March 2011 that the Fifth Amendment can be used to withhold decryption keys or passwords, so the government definitely has its work cut out here. There's really nothing in the physical world that can't eventually be broken into. Even the strongest safe can be opened with the right tools, but this doesn't ring true in the digital world. So law enforcement has asked for backdoors to be created so that the instance where evidence needs to be gathered, it can be retrieved. Now, this can make criminals stronger, and I share the concerns of the government, but I also see some possibility of misuse. If backdoors were created, it would only be a matter of time until criminals figured out what they were and what would make all of our data vulnerable again. And if backdoors were created, remember, this is primarily an issue in the United States, it would also give the United States a huge advantage in the intelligence gathering world, since they could use this technology to access encrypted data on devices in foreign nations. Remember, most of the popular electronic hardware used around the world is made in the United States, especially in the cell phone market. So this backdoor idea could be valuable in other ways. This seems to be something no one else is considering. And then we have the possibility of the detriment for citizens. This backdoor could be used by oppressive governments to further oppress their citizens, and it could be used to keep dissenters and whistleblowers from highlighting problems that they encounter. So here's the reality. Governments are not going to stop encrypting information. And people are also not going to stop encrypting information. Even if it became illegal tomorrow, many people will continue to use encryption technologies and will likely create new ways to hide information. There's really no chance of thousands of years of history suddenly ending because someone says you can't do it anymore. But it does create a bit of an unlevel playing field that gives governments more power. And, at least in the United States, we like to have our checks and balances, and we like to keep some level of control over our own personal lives and our business affairs that the government cannot disrupt.